Hey guys, in today's episode I'm going to be talking about position-specific conditioning for hockey players, looking at how we can make the conditioning sessions that we're doing more relevant to the playing line that you're in, and how this overlaps with some of the work from Gareth Sanford around different running profiles. And so I've spoken about this previously with regards to a speed, hybrid and endurance profile. And what I'm going to be talking about is how the three overlap quite nicely with the playing positions and how you can therefore make your conditioning more relevant to you depending on the playing position that you play in. So one small caveat to this before I get going is that this isn't designed to be individualized. So not all forwards, for example, are going to be speed profiles and not all defenders are going to be endurance profiles. But in the main, it gives you a good kind of ballpark to start with if you haven't quite worked out your running profile yet and you predominantly play that position. Just gives you a starting point for knowing, okay, this is the kind of conditioning sessions I should begin by doing and then begin to refine that over time. So this isn't meant to be exclusively what you should do. This is just to give you a rough idea of the type of sessions that are going to be more relevant to you depending on the position that you play. So if we start by looking at the playing lines first, and then I'll talk about the running profiles after that. So to keep this simple, I've just gone with forwards, midfielders and defenders. And obviously depending on things like tactically, where you play, whether you're a half-back or a centre-back, or whether you're playing in the screen versus playing in a different position in midfield, all of those things are obviously going to be factors. But just for simplicity's sake, I've made this as simple as I can with three different categories and three different playing lines, just to make it less nuanced and give you some clear direction. So when we look at forwards, generally speaking, the running demands of a forward are going to be that they need to perform the highest amount of sprint meters per minute played, whereas compared with defenders, they're going to be on the pitch for less time, generally speaking. That's just dependent a little bit on the playing level that you're currently playing at, how long you do spend on the pitch, how the rotations work and all that kind of thing. But if you're a forward at a half decent level, then you're probably going to be doing shorter rotations and they're going to be quite intensive because you're going to be leading the press and you're going to be doing lots of intensive work on the pitch when you're there. A midfielder is probably going to be a blend of both, so you're going to need to be able to do lots of repeat sprint work, but also have to have a high aerobic component because of the total amount of distances covered. And generally speaking, midfielders cover the most amount of high speed running because of that fact, where you've got intensive work and the total volumes of running that are required as a midfielder because of the amount of ground that you're covering. And then lastly, defenders, and again, I haven't differentiated here between a half-back and a centre-back, but generally speaking, they're going to be on the pitch for longer and they're going to be therefore covering greater total distances and not doing quite as much repeatable sprint work compared with a forward, and therefore the intensity of the meters that you're running at per minute that you're on the pitch is going to be lower. So relatively less intense, but the total work might be greater, if that makes sense. So just to break this down even further then, so a forward generally, if they're a speed profile, and generally speaking, people who do play as a forward tend to be quicker because of the demand of the position, and by playing that position, you're going to be doing more sprinting, which may also contribute to making you quicker. So again, just for simplicity's sake, forwards generally are more fast twitch dominant, which is what overlaps with the speed profile in Gareth Sanford's work. So you're a fast twitch dominant athlete with a relatively low maximal aerobic speed score and a high maximal sprint speed. Again, just to caveat that, where it says relatively low mass, that doesn't mean that you haven't got a good mass score. It just means comparatively to your maximal sprint speed score, it's not as relatively high. So you're talking about an athlete who's very, very quick, but relatively speaking to their top speed, their maximal aerobic speed isn't quite as high. It doesn't mean that compared with the average hockey player, you're not fit. It just means that compared with your own individual sprint speed, your maximum aerobic speed is slightly lower. So what this means is you've got a very large anaerobic speed reserve, which is the difference then between your aerobic fitness and your maximal sprint speed. And because of that, generally speaking, they're going to be more suited to shorter, intensive conditioning sessions. So I'll give you some examples of those in a second. A midfielder, because of the nature of being both needing to be able to do repeat sprint work and have to do lots of total sort of running volume on the pitch as well, going to be a blend of two. So you've got a moderate mass score and a moderate maximal sprint speed score. Having said that, some midfielders have also got the highest mass scores of all and have also got some of the highest maximal sprint speed scores. But that figures because it's this hybrid profile in the middle here. And so you're going to suit a mixture of both speed and endurance focused conditioning sessions. So again, I'll give you some examples of that, but typically things like one longer interval, one shorter interval per week would give you that kind of mix of conditioning sessions that you may need to meet the demands of the playing position in the midfield. Finally, then, as a defender, you're going to be slightly more slow twitch dominant with a relatively high mass score. So aerobically very fit, but a relatively low maximal sprint speed. And again, the reason for this is that typically defenders, unless something's gone horribly wrong, shouldn't need to be hitting top sprint speed at regular intervals, unless it's a turn back, to defend quickly because of a kind of a turnover, having to sprint back really, really quick. But again, these are the situations that we don't really want defenders to be in that often, whereas for a forward, we do want them hitting high speeds to kind of make breaks, create space, create goal-scoring opportunities. So what this means is they've got a small anaerobic speed reserve because that gap between the high maximal aerobic speed and relatively low top speed is quite small. And so generally speaking, because of that, they're more suited to longer, more extensive conditioning sessions. So things like 2, 3 or 4 minute intervals for that very reason. Again, just to caveat this though, if the playing position does give you a lot of this kind of work, sometimes you can argue you might need the opposite. So this isn't to say that this is the only thing you should be doing. It's just that this is generally a good thing to be focused on to begin with, if this is your playing position. And then you can get into the subtleties of, for example, depending on the period of the season, what you're focused on. So periodizing this in a little bit more of a specific manner. Now, just to give you examples here of different types of sessions you could be doing then as a forward. Examples would be 15 on, 15 off as a maximum aerobic speed session. So you would take as an example, 16 pitch length score, and you'd be running for 15 seconds at typically 115 or 110, 115, 120% of that speed for 15 seconds, and then either an active or a passive recovery in between, so either jogging or walking in between those intervals. Or you might do really intensive work like 5 seconds of work and 30 seconds of recovery, and that would be called repeat sprint ability work. The reason why you might want to do that kind of work is because we know from research that generally a player at a forward line is going to be doing something like 1 to 2 high intensity actions per minute whilst they're on the pitch. And so what that would give you is 2 high intensity intervals per minute whilst you're on the pitch, and that will kind of meet and exceed the needs of that playing position. Midfielder then, as we've said, is probably going to need something like 1 long, 1 short interval per week, but again, that just depends on the period of the season and multiple other factors. But you could do something like 1 long interval, which would be 2 minutes of work, 1 minute off, so a very aerobic focused training session, and then 1 shorter interval session, which is 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, which again is going to be slightly more intensive and tends to be above maximum aerobic speed. And again, both of those 2 intervals will be prescribed off of maximum aerobic speed because they are using a mass-based prescription. Finally, then, as a defender, you've got things like 3 minute or 4 minute intervals with, generally speaking, slightly less recovery compared with the work period. So things like 3 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 4 minutes on, 3 minutes off will mean you get a really big aerobic hit in that time period and a relatively shorter period of recovery in order to make sure that you're getting big, what we call central adaptations. So adaptations to the heart and lungs, increased ability to deliver oxygenated blood to the working muscles, and also to be able to increase things like cardiac output. So you're able to just deliver higher volumes of blood around the body. That's what we call central adaptation. So that kind of gives you a framework for, depending on the type of playing position you are in, a type of session that may be beneficial for you to begin with. Now, as I've already said, a defender wouldn't exclusively do extensive intervals, and at the right time they might be doing repeat sprint ability intervals, like the most intensive work you can do. Or a forward, for whatever reason, might need to be really improving their mass score. And so in combination with intensive work may also just be interspersing some longer intervals for that slightly more central adaptation if they're not quite getting that work in there. Other little caveats would be, depending on the time of the season, if it's the off season and the volume of hockey has dropped right off, you will probably need to increase the total distances you're running over the course of a week. and something like 5 seconds on, 30 seconds off just isn't going to give you enough volume of work. Whereas a 3-minute or a 4-minute interval is going to allow you to run multiple kilometers in a session, which will probably increase the total volume of work that you're able to do in a week, and so might be more appropriate if that's the situation. So there's lots of different layers of complexity in how you go about programming this, but this just gives you a good sort of framework to begin with. Depending on the playing position that if you are in, you know that if you're a forward, generally speaking, slightly more intensive work's going to be needed. As a midfield, kind of a combination of both. And as a defender, the total volume of work is probably going to be the most important thing of all to begin with, and then you can start to layer on top of that some slightly more intensive work later on. Now, I've also put in the past sort of various articles and things out there around how you kind of structure these conditioning sessions. So I'll link that down below as well. But I hope that's been useful and a good overview of how we can basically piece together conditioning based on playing lines.